Salute discipuli. Today's video is the first lesson in chapter 13 in Latin for the New Millennium, volume 2. And we're going to learn a construction that uses a participle. And this construction is called the ablative absolute. Now, actually, the ablative absolute is very common in Latin. In fact, you cannot read Latin literature without knowing and recognizing the ablative absolute. As I said, it uses a participle. So the ablative absolute is a type of participial phrase. And in order to have an ablative absolute, you typically need a noun and a participle, both in the ablative, hence ablative absolute. Now, the absolute part comes from the fact that it is kind of its own special little unit within a sentence, meaning that the ablative absolute is actually not grammatically related to the rest of the sentence at all. It's its own little absolute, its own little separate thing. The ablative noun or pronoun in an ablative absolute phrase generally comes first and the participle is placed after it. And then in between the two is anything that could be in the predicate of the participle. Okay, so remember that participial phrases, if it's an active, participle can take a direct object. If it's passive, it can take an ablative of agent and any other things in its predicate that, for the most part, that an indicative or subjunctive verb, a finite verb can do, okay? Sometimes the ablative absolute, though, is not a noun and a participle. Sometimes it's two nouns. Now, the reason for this is because there actually is an implied participle in the ablative absolute. The implied participle is the more or less non-existent participle present active or really present active participle of the verb to be essay, okay? Now, why am I telling you this? Because when you have two nouns in the ablative that are forming an ablative absolute with the implied participle to be, this was actually the way that the Romans recorded dates, okay, so years in Roman history. So there was a long list in Rome of every year and the two men who were consul during that year. And this is how the Romans said this took place in what we would call, say 42 BC, 44 BC, 197 BC, whatever. They told it by saying it was the year that these two men were consuls. So, for example, if they wanted to say that something took place in what we would consider 59 BCE, they would say Caesare et Bibulo consulibus with the implied essay. So with Caesar and Bibulus being consuls, or when Caesar and Bibulus were consuls. This is how we know what their dates were and how we can match them up with our own dates. Okay, so the ablative absolute is an ablative, for the most part, an ablative and a participle in the ablative, an ablative noun and a participle in the ablative. So how do you translate it? The most basic way to translate an ablative absolute, basic, y'all, is you translate it with the noun either participling if it's the present active participle, having been participled if it's the perfect passive participle, about to participle, whatever. So I give you a couple examples of how to do it. So here are 3 examples of an ablative absolute. We have our ablative noun, agricula, and then we have a present active participle, amanti, a perfect passive, amato, and a future active, amatoro, okay? So the most basic way to translate agricula amanti is with the farmer loving, okay? Because we're translating that present active participle as a present active participle. Agricula amato, with the farmer having been loved, and agricula amatoro, with the farmer about to love. Now, just like other participial phrases, it actually sounds a little awkward to translate the ablative absolute this way, right? This isn't something that we do very often. in English. And as a matter of fact, if you hear people saying this kind of construction, well, with the meaning over, I, blah, 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 um, ask them if they took Latin, because I've only ever really met people who have studied Latin or Greek with the ablative or the genitive absolute, use this kind of phrasing at all, because it's just not natural in English, okay? So sometimes you're going to have to translate the ablative absolute um, in a little bit different of a way. Often, like so many times with participial phrases, we have to make them into subordinate clauses, okay? And very often, when we make the ablative absolute into a subordinate clause, they become like a circumstantial or a causal or a concessive clause, which we learned in chapter 12, right? So, as circumstantial, it can translate when the farmer was loving. Causal, since the farmer was loving, or concessive, although the farmer was loving. So all ways that we could alternatively translate agricula amanti, okay? Also keep in mind, the ablative absolute, like every other participial phrase, the participle within the ablative absolute, its tense is relative, meaning that it's telling you when the participle happened in relation to the action of the main verb, not an absolute tense, okay? So you have to look at the tense of the main verb and then translate the present participle in the ablative absolute as the same tense, the perfect participle as occurring beforehand, and the future participle as occurring afterwards, okay? Okay, I have a couple of examples here, and I think you should push pause, write these out, attempt a translation, and then I will give you the translation, which you should also write in your notes. Number one, Roma visa milites gaudebant. You don't know what gaudebant means. It means they were rejoicing, okay? So, Roma visa, okay, right here. Let me go ahead and get my pen. Roma visa is our ablative absolute. We have our perfect passive participle here in the ablative, and then we have the noun. And so, again, the most basic way of translating this, with Rome having been seen, the soldiers were rejoicing. But that just sounds a little bit awkward in English. So you can say, when Rome was seen, the soldiers were rejoicing, or since Rome was seen, the soldiers were rejoicing, okay? This next one, his rabies auditis timere coipi. Again, we have our ablative absolute here. Here it is. We want to translate our ablative absolute separate from the main sentence, as always. Remember, the whole point of an absolute, of the absolute part of the ablative absolute, is that it's not grammatically related to the rest of the sentence. So you can just translate coipi timere, I began to fear. But we also have this ablative absolute to go on. So with these affairs, these matters having been heard, these things having been heard, I began to fear. And again, we can translate the his rabies auditis, the ablative absolute, when these things were heard, since these things were heard, I began to fear. Okay. Tyranno imperium tenente, senatores ex urbe fugerant, right? So with the tyrant holding power, the senators fled from the city. Or again, with the tyrant holding power is the most basic way to translate the ablative absolute. We could say, since the tyrant was holding power, the senators fled from the city. The next sentence, quibus patriam defendentibus spem habere quipimus. So here we have our ablative noun, right? We have our ablative participle, and now this participle, patriam, is taking a direct object, okay? So And notice that it's then placed between the noun and the participle in the ablative absolute. So I began to have hope is our main sentence. With the citizens defending the country land, I began to have hope. Okay, so, and again, with the citizens defending the country, the country or the fatherland, sounds a little bit awkward. So you could say, when the citizens were defending the country or were defending the fatherland, I began to have hope. Okay, notice here we have Caesare Duce, nihil timebimus. No participle in the ablative. We have one of these examples of the two nouns in the ablative making an ablative absolute with an implied ablative participle of esse. So we will fear nothing with Caesar being, you have to include in English that implied to be, with Caesar being general, or since Caesar is general, we will fear nothing. Again, here we have a noun with with an adjective with the implied verb to be. With Caesar being uncertain, the enemies attacked Rome. So when Caesar was uncertain, or since Caesar was uncertain, the enemies attacked Rome. Okay, so make sure that you have the Latin written down, that you also have the English translations as I've gone over them written down. Take very good notes, and I will see you in class. Valete.